From BJ Penn grabbing the mic and uttering the line, "Sean Shirk, you're dead," to Daniel Cormier getting his chance to tell Jon Jones that he can't run forever from him. The UFC doesn't seem to have any shortage of insane callouts. So let's narrow down some of the greatest ones in history. To start off, we have BJ Penn on the mic. So, back in 2007, BJ Penn, the former welterweight champ, made a return to the division. He beat his old rival, Jens Pulver, in his first fight at 155 pounds. But he couldn't fight the champ, Sean Shirk, because he tested positive for steroids and was suspended. Penn was understandably pissed about the whole thing. Anyway, he ended up facing Joe Stevenson for the now vacant title. And boy, did he have a lot to say about Shirk. After choking Stevenson out in the second round to claim the title, Penn grabbed the mic and delivered one hell of a call-out. He didn't even throw any insults at Shirk, just one simple line that got the message across loud and clear. "Sean Shirk, you're dead."
BJ next. "Sean Shirk, you're dead!"
And just like that, a major feud was born. Fans and fighters alike were hyped for this showdown. Fast forward 4 months later, and the two lightweights finally squared off with the title on the line. Penn didn't quite live up to his threat of killing Shirk, but he did come out on top with a brutal TKO in the third round. Fans were losing their minds over the whole thing. It was a wild ride, but in the end, Penn had proven himself to be the better fighter. And another mixed martial artist that managed to live up to his word is Daniel Cormier. So back in 2011, Jon Jones won the UFC light heavyweight title by defending Mauricio Shogun Rua. Everyone knew he was good, but no one expected him to be this dominant. He destroyed everyone he faced, from Quinton Jackson to Rashad Evans. By 2014, there were hardly any challengers left for him. But then, Daniel Cormier, the former Strikeforce heavyweight champ, decided to drop to 205 pounds for a chance to fight Jones. Cormier won his first two fights in the division and called out Jones in the most epic way possible. He basically told Jones that he couldn't hide from him forever and that he was coming for him. DC even claimed that he could take Jones down 100 times if he wanted to. This got UFC fans all riled up and turned Cormier versus Jones into the biggest feud in the promotion. Fans were excited to see these two fighters finally face off, and the fighters themselves were pumped for the challenge. Cormier was confident in his wrestling abilities, while Jones was looking to defend his title and maintain his dominance. It was a fight that everyone wanted to see, and it definitely lived up to the hype. Another fighter that called out his rival for being scared is none other than Nate Diaz. The fighter made a show of calling out Conor McGregor, and boy was it disrespectful. This was back in 2015, when McGregor had just won the UFC featherweight title by beating Jose Aldo. Diaz at the time had been away for a year and was set to fight Michael Johnson a week later. After Diaz defeated Johnson by unanimous decision, he grabbed the mic and went off on a rant. "Conor McGregor, you're taking everything I work for. I'm going to fight you. You know that the real money fight is with me." Joe Rogan even had to remind Diaz that he couldn't talk like that on network TV. But the damage was done. McGregor was used to being the one dishing out the insults. So being disrespectful like this was a shock to him and the whole MMA world. Fans were definitely excited about the possibility of a Diaz versus McGregor fight. And just 3 months later, it actually happened. The fighter stepped in on short notice and defeated McGregor, becoming a superstar in the UFC. Man, that was a legendary call-out. But there's one that still beats it, and it was made by the same fighter. Okay, so back in 2011, the UFC bought out its competitor, Strikeforce, and everyone was hyped to see Georges St-Pierre take on Nick Diaz. They scheduled the fight for UFC 137, but Diaz didn't show up for some media stuff. So Dana White swapped him out for Carlos Condit, He ended up fighting BJ Penn instead. But the buzz was still about GSP versus Diaz. After that, GSP got injured, and Condit was still the top contender. But everyone still wanted to see GSP versus Diaz. The fighter went on to beat Penn. He started mouthing off at GSP, saying he was scared to fight him. And guess what the Canadian did? He responded by pretending to shake, which was pretty funny, with the crowd bursting into laughter. From that moment on, the feud between them just grew exponentially. It took over a year for the UFC to finally get them in the octagon together, but the fans were still super hyped. And the fight ended pulling over 1 million pay-per-view buys. But the anticipation for their actual fight was through the roof. While we're on the subject of Pierre, the fighter himself has made a couple of callouts. Okay, so back in 2006, the UFC welterweight title picture was a bit of a mess. Matt Hughes was the champ, but BJ Penn had beaten him before, only to give up the title. Then Hughes beat Georges to reclaim it. St. Pierre beat Penn in a #1 contenders fight to set up a rematch with Hughes, but he had to pull out due to injury. So the UFC got Penn to fight Hughes instead. After a tough battle, Hughes won by TKO in the 3rd round. Then, out of nowhere, St. Pierre entered the octagon and challenged Hughes for a future title fight, saying, "I'm not impressed by your performance." People were shocked because St. Pierre was usually a respectful fighter who didn't trash talk. Fans and fighters had mixed reactions to the callout. Some were surprised that St. Pierre would be so bold, while others thought it was a clever move to get himself noticed. Regardless, the Canadian would go on to beat Hughes and become one of the greatest UFC champions of all time. And his "not impressed" line would live on as a classic UFC meme for years to come. Though another line that echoes in the UFC halls to this day came from Chael Sonnen. Let me tell you about his epic trash-talking skills in the UFC. So he had this beef with Anderson Silva after losing to him in a title fight back in UFC 117. But when he finally got the chance to call him out again at UFC 136, he took it to a whole new level. During his post-fight interview, he straight up called out Silva, saying, "Anderson Silva, you absolutely suck." Ouch, that must have been something to hear. And then he challenged him to a rematch for the middleweight title, promising to leave the UFC forever if he lost. Fans were going nuts over this callout, some loving the disrespect while others were outraged. But one thing was for sure, everyone wanted to see this fight happen. The UFC listened and booked the rematch for UFC 148, which became one of the most anticipated events in UFC history. Unfortunately for Sonnen, Silva once again defeated him. But the trash talker didn't keep his promise of leaving the UFC. Instead, he continued with his disrespectful callouts. Like this one time he dissed Wanderlei Silva by saying he didn't know they could stack stuff that high before meeting him. Love him or hate him, Chael Sonnen's trash-talking skills were next level and always made for some exciting moments in the UFC. That's all for the greatest UFC callouts.